Hello, I'm Kağan from Istanbul. The title of my presentation is Ki-Duk's The Net, a manifestation of postmodern ethics. In this presentation, I intend to lay bare the close affinity between the worldview presented in Ki-Duk's film The Net and postmodern ethics as defined by Zygmunt Bauman. The main proposal of the presentation is that the individualistic discourse the film gives voice to is a product of postmodern ethics. Towards this aim, I will first briefly outline the film's plot and then critically consider its discourse. I will continue with an outline of Bauman's postmodern ethics, again followed by a critical assessment of it. Finally, I will lay bare the parallelism between the two narratives in means of how they both position the individual against the society and social structures. The Net, being a political satire, bears a minimalistic aesthetic. The film opens with the depiction of the simple life of a North Korean fisherman, Nam. He lives with his family in a village at the border. They don't have the commodities that fill the homes and cities of the modern Westerners. Yet he seems to be content with his work. And a lovemaking scene in the beginning of the film indicates a pleasant family life. The peace is disrupted when the engine of his little boat is caught up in a net, and with the force of the strong tide, he drifts across the river to the South Korean side. The soldiers on the North Korean shore point their rifles at him, fearing he defected, and the guards on the South Korean side take him away immediately, fearing he's a spy. He is prisoned and faces a tough interrogation there, bearing an intense psychological pressure, physical torture, and persistent regime propaganda. From the moment he steps foot on enemy soil, he has his eyes shut, and all the while, he doesn't ever open them, because he knows he will be interrogated about it, what he has seen there when he gets back. The Southerners constantly pressure him to open his eyes, and when they fail, they farcically leave him on the busiest street of Seoul, just so he's forced to open them. When he finally does, what he sees is a carbon copy of any Western metropole infested with global chain stores and brands. All he wants is to be allowed to go back to his peaceful life. When he finally is allowed to go back, he is put through a rough interrogation involving psychological pressure and physical torture and regime propaganda by the Northerners. He returns home traumatized by what he is subjected to, and the failed lovemaking scene indicates the loss of initial peace. The film takes a neutral stance between capitalism and socialism, regimes usually presented as alternatives to one another, when in fact, according to film, they are mirror images of one another, equally oppressive, self-justifying opponents. All their institutions are corrupt, bureaucratic structures, prioritizing self-justification instead of serving citizens. Whereas Nam, the hero, the individual, is portrayed with a much more sympathetic attitude. He doesn't care at all about the self-glorifying ideological discourses of neither of the dehumanized regimes. He is portrayed as a naive, average person, even to the point that he is tricked by someone he meets in prison who turns out to be an actual spy into delivering a message to an outside contact when he is let go by the South Korean authorities. The shutting of his eyes can be characterized as childish. His attempt to smuggle dollars into his homeland, an attempt executed amateurishly and failed, is presented as a hopeless, even tragic, and in any event, understandable minor offense of the everyday man. His actions are guided by chance or momentary impulses. Probably the most suitable adjective for the hero, as portrayed in the film, would be innocent. Mainly because he is fully divorced from the state and the structures that exert their power onto him, subjecting him to various effects of their power. He is portrayed as an isolated entity with no connection and thus no responsibility as to the evil systems that put him under siege. As a result, we are presented with typical structuralist binary oppositions between rival states and between social structures and the individual. A subject-to-object relationship that renders the individual a passive victim who is to be exempted from responsibility. Now I want to consider the postmodern ethics of Zygmunt Bauman in means of how it positions the individual against the social structures and even social codes, specifically ethical or moral codes. Bauman is a fierce critique of modernity, taken from where the Frankfurt scholars left off. He sees modernity as a project for order, which in the first place sought to replace a dogmatic order, but in the end became a dogmatic one in itself. The modernity project is defined by a desire for absolute codes and an intolerance for ambivalence in all areas of human knowledge and activity. This translates as intolerance for difference, resulting in assimilation, repression, and annihilation of both different people and different ideas. That also goes for modern ethics, which seeks to universalize its codes. Bauman objects to the self-universalizing attempt of modern ethics and promotes an individualistic ethics based not in unchanging codes, but in an irrational and natural will. He makes a sharp distinction between the interests of the individual and the interests of the society and its structures. According to him, general ethical codes form a control mechanism devised jointly by philosophers and rulers to circumvent the potential harm of individual freedom. He writes in his postmodern ethics that a universal and objective ethics that is not aporetic and ambivalent is practically impossible. He opposes both of the naturalistic views of human as essentially good or essentially bad, yet he adopts another view that can't escape essentialism either, that humans are morally ambivalent. Because for him, moral phenomena are naturally irrational, that is, they are not based on calculation of benefit. As a result, Bauman places what he calls the moral self in direct opposition to ethical social codes. On the one side is undefined and unfeathered will for goodness, and on the other, absolute and calculated rules of participation in society. According to him, such postmodern ethics does not lead to a nihilistic relativism resulting in whatever works type of behavior. Quite the contrary, it brings the individual closer to acting morally an attitude missing in the codified ethics of modernity. In short, Bauman forms a binary opposition by ascribing the irrational and individualistic morality to one pole and the rational and social morality to the other. His pitting of the individual against the social follows directly from Emmanuel Levinas' philosophy. Levinas bases his ethics on the existential priority of the other. For Levinas, the harmonious and metaphysical relationship between I and the other is disrupted when a third party is introduced. In his Totality and Infinity, Levinas writes, "To the extent the face of the other is linked to third persons, the metaphysical relation of the I to the other transforms into the shape of a we, which strives for institutions, for a state, for laws serving as the source of universality." In his book, Community, Seeking Safety in an Unsafe World, Bauman similarly defines community as a uniforming structure limiting and suppressing the individual's freedom and autonomy. Thus, postmodern ethics, as defined by Bauman, is founded on a sharp distinction between the individual and what Levinas calls social totalities. We are then facing, in Bauman's philosophy, the mother of all structuralist binary oppositions, namely Rousseau's nature-culture dichotomy, disguised as individualistic morals versus societal ethics, a non-coded individual in its purest form versus culturally constructed rational subject. In this light, returning to Ki-Duk's film, The Net, we can read Nam's naivety as a sign of his freedom from cultural structuration. His innocence and purity is maintained by his indifference to the states and their discourses. The place of his origin, the unmodernized border village, thus, serves as a natural habitat, mostly protected from the effects of culture. In conclusion, postmodern ethics, based not on social codes but individualistic intuition, creates the illusion for an autonomous self, focused on his immediate interests, legitimacy of which is enforced by the conception of social totalities, including the state and its structures, as self-serving formations, hostile to the individual. Thus, we can state as a final word, Ki-Duk's film, The Net, is a manifestation of postmodern ethics. Thank you.